talking Covenant. This is a supernatural horror movie directed by Manuel H. De Silva, and this one stars Nick Smyth, Peter Valdron, and Margarita Soldakova. Now, the story here, we have a prologue at the beginning of the movie where we see some type of satanic ritual happening in the woods, and the mother seems to get away with it, got the baby that was meant to be sacrificed, and she's picked up by this policeman. Cut to 30 or so years later, the baby is now an adult, and he's this kind of ex-army guy who is coming to deal with the death of his mother, his estranged mother at this point. And there seems to be supernatural and certainly satanic elements here that are wanting to maybe carry on the sacrificial ritual that was going on 30 years previously. And we see various threats, and we have potentially allies in maybe this police sheriff who rescued him when he was a baby, and maybe this kind of mysterious female that sort of turns up as well and seems to kind of help him out of nowhere. So what do we think about Covenant? Okay, so low budget movie. There are some definite positives here, and there are some definite negatives. We will talk about the positives first, however. Now, this being a low budget movie, I was impressed with some of the practical effects here. Now, I'll emphasis on practical because we're going to come to the digital effects in a minute. The practical effects here, and certainly the makeup that we see and some of the demonic kind of creatures and stuff here is to a good standard. There's this kind of like this demonic kind of head bad guy, if you like. He looks pretty good, I've got to say. I do feel he's a little overlit in some scenes. We see him in kind of the broad daylight in a couple of scenes, and it doesn't really work in that sequence. But there are other sequences where I feel that the kind of the darkness makes him certainly look kind of more menacing, and he'll give off almost like a Darth Maul kind of vibe here. I thought he looked pretty good. I actually thought the setup was very good for this movie. It was an intriguing setup, and I wanted to find out what was going to happen to this character. I really enjoyed some of the peripheral characters here as well. I really actually quite like the two police officers that we have here. We have the guy that originally going to rescue him, and then we get in more recent times, his younger partner. There's also some quite good gags in this movie. One of the policemen is, for example, very short, and our kind of protagonist calls him Mini-Me. And I just thought it was quite fun. It was a throwaway gag. And there's a couple of lines here which I thought were quite fun, admittedly. Our main protagonist is also somewhat cast against type in regards to, well, he's portrayed, maybe not he's not cast against type, his character is an unlikable guy. Now, this is both a positive and a negative, and the negatives I'll come on to. But it makes it for a different type of central character. He's a deadbeat dad. He is avoiding paying his alimony and all of that, and he seems to be a little bit washed up. He seems to be outrageously rude to this kind of policeman who really doesn't seem to be hassling him too badly, and very disrespectful to his mother, things like that. So, it's interesting to have a character who is deliberately so dislikable, because it's so often the case. Obviously, we're meant to, as the audience, be able to root for the character and kind of be able to sympathise with them. And here the guy is just a complete asshole, and he's a bit of a wise ass. So it's a brave move to have a character who was so, quite frankly, despicable. But then, if we segue into the negatives here, you feel he's an asshole. So to be honest with you, you somewhat feel like he gets what's coming to him to a certain degree, and it is hard to sympathise for someone who is so despicable. And one of the things that bothered me in this movie was his motivation in this film is he wants to try and rescue his son. Yet the film tells us that he's a deadbeat dad and hasn't and has basically skipped town on his family. And we're told he's married twice, although I think he may have only had the one child. But the movie certainly gives you the impression that he's essentially run out on his wife and child. And therefore, but he's all of a sudden, we're meant to kind of root for him when he, obviously his child is in danger, when he seems to have completely abandoned them to begin with. So there's that. I've mentioned the special effects here in the broadcast, the practical effects. On the flip side here, and I feel this is what people are going to be, when people watch this movie, this is what they are going to be focusing on, is the digital effects here are extraordinarily poor. The kind of the effects have been overlaid over obviously real footage, and they simply look like cartoon, like laser effects and electricity and stuff like that. It's done to such a poor standard. It would have been better just to not have them. And maybe just kind of work around and maybe have like invisible forces or something like that. The fact that they have these kind of, these very poor digital effects is to the movie's massive detriment, because it really makes it look so cheap. And they also use a hell of a lot of them. So I feel the movie tries to have these, like, you know, these creepy things happening in the background, where we have ghostly visages kind of behind the character, and it just looks crap because a lot of they're emphasised by these digital effects. I have to say as well, the setup is strong, but I've got to say, when this movie ultimately turns into a chase film, it becomes a little dull, because it just is these guys being chased through the woods, and there's not much more to it than that. There's also a really bad fight scene with these three like demonic creatures that come out, and they're basically guys with like black eye makeup, but there's quite a poor fight scene, I must say. There's also no big surprise here when there's a twist at the end. I feel, did you not see this coming? I mean, like I've said, it kind of, you don't feel particularly sympathetic for our protagonist. So what do we think about this movie? How do we rate it? Because I do feel there's some good work with the practical effects. I do feel there are at least an interesting setup. And I'd say that maybe the first act of the movie is solid, even though it has some dodgy, digital effects. But that kind of chase sequence, which is basically the remaining 2/3 of the film, gets dull and tiresome, because this guy is so irritating through the movie. And because I would say this movie is 1/3 pretty good, 2/3 below average, I'm going to give this a slightly below average mark at a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.